Hi, everybody. I've been at several of the sessions, but haven't had a chance to fully introduce myself. I'm Brian Tokar. I was introduced to social ecology back in the 1970s through the anarchist and anti-nuclear movements, became involved with the Institute in the 1980s, have been teaching social ecology since the 90s. I also I'm a lecturer in the environmental program at the University of Vermont and have written a number of books specifically on the theme of climate justice. I did this one first, originally came out in 2010, Toward Climate Justice. It was revised in 2014, and then the brand new one, which I'll be saying more about later, which is an edited collection of writing from around the world and contributed international chapters on various aspects of climate justice and Renewal. And then I'll also show you the book that I mentioned during the discussion, I think yesterday morning, Earth for Sale, which came out in the late 90s, which was really one of the first books to really focus on the tensions between the more mainstream and more alternative leaning aspects of the environmental movement, based on research really going back to the time of the 20th anniversary of Earth Day in 1990. And it's kind of astounding that we just passed the 50th. I've been involved in climate justice work. Well, I started out focusing on energy issues, the anti-nuclear movement in the States, after a time focusing on toxins, toxic chemicals in the early years of environmental justice, and on green politics, and several years of a project that the ISC focused on biotechnology. And I got back into energy and climate issues really during one of the early periods of discussions around climate justice in the mid-2000s, around 2006, 2007. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in just a bit. I guess I'll have a drink of my yerba mate and start right in. So it's been interesting to see how climate justice has become an increasingly familiar term, both in movement discourse and even in a lot.
You're frozen, Brian.
I'm frozen. Oh, crap.
Now you're okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. The internet connection here is often unstable. I was going to host this session. It's a good thing that I'm not. Everybody would have been bounced off.
Can I make a suggestion?
If it happens again, yeah.
So you can actually use your phone as the audio. You can call in. So the audio settings, you can choose to call in, and it gives you like a number.
I have that in my email. Why don't I open that email in case I need to switch to that. Hopefully I won't, because I also have slides to show you. Okay, I have the call info open on my other screen now in case I need it.
Okay.
So climate justice has become somewhat familiar terminology, but as recently as the mid-2000s, it was really a pretty new idea. And it emerged really as an alternative to safe white environmentalism, which we've become increasingly aware of the problems with over these last several weeks. In the mid-2000s, the leading symbol of climate activism was the famous drowning polar bear, and the increasing impact on especially marginalized people around the world of climate problems was just beginning to get on the radar and was far from the center of the conversation. With the climate justice frame, people in the movement became increasingly aware that we can't really have climate progress unless we look at the disproportionate impacts on various people around the world, look at the roots of the climate crisis in capitalism, and have a really broad understanding of issues of race and class in the environmental movement. So I'm going to show you just a few charts to highlight the issue of disproportionate impacts. And then I'll talk mostly about the evolution of the movement, of the movements for climate justice. It's important to state that in the plural because we're far from having a single coherent vehicle for expressing these politics. And a little bit about the specific contributions of social ecology. So those are the three themes that I'm going to try to focus on in the next 20 minutes or so. So I will do my slides, and I can use the video for slides and phone for audio, but the video takes way more bandwidth than the audio, so that might or might not be practical. So I'm going to go to screen sharing and get the right screen visible, which is this one here. So can folks see that map?
Affirmative.
Okay, so climate justice, as it's really begun to be explored in more depth, has really clarified the extent to which those who contribute the least to excess emissions of greenhouse gases will be, but also, as we'll see in a minute, for quite a long time have been far more impacted by climate change than, say, most people in the global north. And of course, the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen steady news of weather-related climate disasters, and there's an increasingly sophisticated science of climate attribution that's able to actually dissect out the climate component of specific weather events, something we weren't able to do 10 or 15 years ago. But if you take a look at this map, you can see that most of the places in the world that these researchers at McGill, who looked at a wide array of demographic variables to measure climate vulnerability, which is here in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the few places that's actually colored in red on both maps. And there's a PDF of all of the data-oriented charts from this discussion that Blair either has made available or will be making available to you. So I can go through them quickly and you'll get a chance to look at them again. This chart is actually pretty old. It goes back to the UN Human Development Report in 2007. Somebody's trying to text me. It might be related to this, but I can't pick up my phone and keep talking at the same time. Grace, can you nod your head if you can still hear me? Shit.
You're okay now, Brian, but you have been getting stuck a couple of times.
Okay, hi is excellent. really kind of impossible to follow at the same time that I'm trying to present. So you can hear me now, okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I trust that you heard most of what I had to say about this. This is from the UN Human Development Report in 2007, and this is really to illustrate the extent to which this is not a new phenomenon, this discrepancy in climate impacts. On the left, comparing the number of people affected by climate-related disasters in a year, the black bars being the higher income OECD countries and so-called developing countries in the red. Hugely disproportionate impacts going back to the mid-1970s, long before there was a significant literature on climate change or anything remotely describable as a climate movement. The chart on the right looks at it in per capita terms, and the take-home message is that the disproportionate impacts were in the order of 50 to 1 back in the mid-80s, a little bit less as weather disasters began to be more of an issue in the global north by the first half of the 2000s, but still vastly disproportionate impacts. And then finally, we know that extreme weather events are increasing. I don't know if this came through in the earlier part of what I said. We have an increasingly sophisticated science of climate attribution, where the ability to discern the climate contributions of specific weather events, something that wasn't really possible 10 or 15 years ago, has become an increasingly sophisticated area of climate science, and we can actually look at the climate component of specific events like flooding events and extreme droughts, etc. And we see here that the rate of extreme has doubled since the previous chart. I'm going to just skip over this one. You can look at it on your own time. This is the IPCC from 2014, and this is just to illustrate the extent to which the understandings of climate justice have increasingly become a part of mainstream climate science. Since we're focusing for these two sessions on both agriculture and climate, I wanted to give you a look at the range of estimates for how much the food system contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And Grace will have more to say about this tomorrow. But the USDA continues to focus on a very low estimate of about 8%. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization and the Intergovernmental Panel, which is, of course, the collaboration of climate scientists from around the world, estimating in the range of 12 to 14%. Most independent scholars and activists looking at added factors like land use changes, fertilizer production, which turns out to be a huge source of emissions, estimating more in the range of 20 to 30%. There is one outlier study that was funded by the World Bank in the late 2000s that said 50% of emissions are from livestock alone. That study, from what I've been reading, has mostly been debunked, but it's a number that's out there and that does get quoted every once in a while. So to give you a sense of the range of estimates. So all of these issues were not able to be brought to the fore in mainstream climate discourse by the strength of the science or the strength of the data. It's taken tremendous mobilization of people from around the world to raise these issues in various international forums. Some of the first discussions of climate justice, and I document this in my book and a number of other articles I've written in book chapters, goes back to discussions in the early 2000s, both internationally and within the US environmental justice movement. led by people like Tom Goldtooth of the Indigenous Environmental Network. The first real presence of climate justice activists at a major UN conference is illustrated by this set of photos by my friend Oren Langell from the Global Justice Ecology Project. In 2007, when a lot of indigenous groups and others rallied around the UN climate conference in Bali in Indonesia. At that meeting, broad alliance called Climate Justice Now articulated a set of demands: reduce consumption in the north, climate debts, keep fossil fuels in the ground, land and resource conservation, especially focused on indigenous land rights, and also a demand for sustainable agriculture and food sovereignty. The indigenous element and the contribution of other land-based popular movements from around the world continues to be one of the central elements of the climate justice movement. This is from Copenhagen 2009, which was the first time there was really a mass demonstration of over 1,000 people at the UN Climate Conference. The following session of the climate conference included Mexico, and the demonstrations were led by Via Campesina, which came up yesterday in Sylvia's discussion, and we'll have a lot more to say about probably tomorrow. Global network of small farmer movements kind of reclaiming the identity of campesinos, campesinas. It's really one of the most vital social movements in the world, I would say. And then this is Paris in 2015, outside the UN Climate Conference, the delegation of the Indigenous Environmental Network and a few allies from an organization folks might be familiar with called the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is a people of color-led global justice group that's also supporting a lot of people of color climate activism throughout North America. And then, of course, the largest ever indigenous mobilization in North America, possibly in the world, was Standing Rock in 2016, when people from indigenous nations from all over North America and around the world and supporters came together in the thousands to try to block the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I hope people are familiar with that. If you aren't, it's a really important campaign to look at. The second major contributor to this course of the environmental justice movement, which comes out of communities of color in North America, exposing and challenging their disproportionate exposure to toxic chemicals and other environmental stresses. This is from 2009, the first wave of climate justice organizing in Richmond, California. Hillary, who we heard from yesterday, was part of this demonstration and in organizing. And California is an oil refinery town. Chevron Oil is the major employer. People have been organizing for decades to hold them accountable for the toxic exposure, high levels of toxic exposure in the community. And this was one of the first really visible examples of an environmental justice community in the US embracing the demand for. Years later, in 2016, folks gathered in Albany, New York to support a community that's directly adjacent to a huge rail yard where oil is transferred from barges to trains to ship down to New York City, and the levels of various environmental illnesses, especially among the children in that community, is very high, and people from all around the region came together to support that community. On that same day in 2016 was a global mobilization around the theme of break free from fossil fuels. This was the same day, for example, in South Africa. The other crucial element of climate justice, of course, is the systemic critique. The slogan "system change, not climate change" is probably the quickest way to encapsulate that. A lot of this tendency in the movement, especially in Europe, is represented by continuing elements from the anti-globalization / alter-globalization / global justice movement that had its major launching event here in the US almost exactly 20 years ago with the mobilization against the World Trade Organization in Seattle. And that the continuing elements of that movement and some of the organizers from that movement that have been brought on by even relatively mainstream networks like 350.org have really, in many ways, continued to shape the character of the climate movement. This was a blockade of Wall Street that happened the day right after the huge People's Climate March in New York in 2014. And this element of the movement, of course, highlights the explicitly anti-capitalist focus in the understanding of, again, the origins of the climate crisis in the practices of the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of important history there that I don't have time to go into. Recommend Andreas Malm's work on the origins of fossil fuels. And then finally, the melding of the oppositional and reconstructive elements of the movement, something we've been talking about throughout this program. And back in 2015, in the lead up to the Paris conference, the alternative building element was illustrated by a huge bicycle tour that toured the perimeter of France in the lead up to the Paris. And I think there's still a alternativa.eu website that documents a lot of that. And I'm getting an unstable internet signal, internet warning. Again, for me, I will change channels if I get stalled. But if folks going to get, if the only cues that I can really follow are audio, I can't run slides and look at my phone at the same time, unfortunately. That would.
You have cut out momentarily a couple of times, but not bad.
Good, thank you. So the synthesis of the oppositional and reconstructive elements of the climate justice movement. Just a few more quick images of the community building, community renewal dimensions of climate justice. This is a big garden in Detroit. Detroit is one of the case studies that's described by some authors who have been organizing there for many decades in my new book, where with the shift in the auto industry out of Detroit, which was the world center of automobile production for many decades, over the last 30 years, as plants have moved out of the region, as the use of labor in the auto industry has been replaced by automation to a huge degree. The city has been hollowed out. There are vacant houses, vacant lots, entire vacant city blocks, and those have been reclaimed by people in the community to build gardens and other efforts to support the lives and livelihoods of people in the city of Detroit. This is a community garden in Vienna, Austria. There's a chapter by social ecologist and old friend of ours, Carl Ludwig Scheibel, in my book about various green city efforts across Europe. This is an agroecology farm growing taro in Puerto Rico. Our old friend and colleague Nelson Alvarez, who was an ISE student many decades ago, has I think, a brilliant chapter in my book about how the farms that have adopted agroecology methods in Puerto Rico have been in the forefront of the recovery from the devastating flooding and the hurricane, Hurricane Maria, that struck Puerto Rico and wiped out many islands throughout the Caribbean back in 2017. And this is in Harlem, a project that Kelly Roach, who many, if not all of you, met this last few days, that Kelly wrote about in my book, a group called We Act, that's been in the forefront of environmental justice organizing in Harlem, launching a campaign to solarize public housing, to employ people from the neighborhood in installing those panels, and really bringing together the oppositional and reconstructive dimensions of climate justice in the Black community in Harlem in New York City. So just want to briefly talk a little bit about some of the ways that an understanding of social ecology helps strengthen our understandings in this movement. How am I doing time-wise? I'm not sure what time I started. I can't hear you now, you're muted.
It's 10:35 now, so you've got it. I would say another 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes is good. So there are a number of points here. Again, they'll be in the PDF of the slides that you can get if you haven't already gotten from Blair. Obviously, social ecology focuses on understanding the social and political and economic roots of the climate crisis. I mentioned how fossil fuels have played an essential role in not just the origins of climate problems, but the origins of capitalism as we know it, the whole myth of unlimited growth and the goal of perpetual expansion of the system, as again, Andreas Malm, that's M-A-L-M, has documented in tremendous detail, can be traced directly back to the origins of the fossil fuel economy. There's also been a proliferation of false solutions proposed by various ideologues of capitalism in the climate movement. The notion of carbon markets being the most blatant, and climate justice activists have from the beginning been in the forefront of challenging those various false solutions. Of course, as social ecologists, we embrace the justice-centered outlook. We acknowledge that people on the front lines, the most affected communities and their experiences, offer tremendous insight and wisdom as to how to address the climate crisis more generally. But we also know from some of Murray Bookchin's historical research that justice is not enough, that the whole understanding of justice emerged from a period of time when hierarchical institutions were beginning to be increasingly entrenched in various societies, and the understanding of justice as a way of reacting to increasing injustice in society, playing a fundamental role in liberation movements throughout human history, but also falling short often of a more genuine embrace of the kinds of expansive notions of freedom that we talk about in social ecology. So justice is essentially important, but also not enough. We've talked some about intersectionality, in the case of climate, the links between race and class and indigeneity and other factors. And as social ecologists, we raise the question, how do we move even further toward a more comprehensive challenge to hierarchy and understanding the deep roots of myths of domination and the links between myths of domination of nature and the origins of relations of domination among people. We embrace, as I mentioned in the case of Kelly's chapter in my book, the demands for energy democracy, which have emerged partly from alliances of international trade union movements, the trend toward remunicipalization of many social services that were privatized during the height of the neoliberal era. TNI is the Transnational Institute. That's a European organization that's published a number of interesting reports about this trend toward remunicipalization of previously privatized public services. How do we move from that toward directly democratic community control of energy systems, food systems, and the entire economy? As social ecologists, we embrace the vision of a broad movement of movements. Maybe there was some discussion on Sunday of some of the historical roots of that notion in the Paris Commune in the 1870s. And of course, the broader goal of confederating our movements, but also confederating our communities to reclaim power more comprehensively. Pretty talked about the linkages between resistance and renewal. The resistance element is often described as blockadia, which is kind of the geographic spaces of resistance that emerge around the world where people are organizing against fossil fuel infrastructure and other forms of extraction. Alternativa from France in 2015 and the whole array of alternative building aspects of the movement. The aspiration of a higher quality of life with less consumption in the global north. Many of us are in touch with folks in the degrowth movement in Europe. In the European context, it's often got an explicitly anti-capitalist dimension, which is often lacking in discussions of growth here in the US setting. And then, of course, looking forward toward a longer range vision of a completely different political and economic system and a fundamentally liberated society where communities actually can thrive in harmony with the rest of the natural world. I'm going to mostly end on that note. I want to just briefly put in a plug for my brand new book. If you order it online from Routledge this summer, you can get a 50% discount with this code. Again, this slide is also in the PDF that I'll send. We're also doing a series of webinars through an organization called the People's Hub. If you go to peopleshub.org, the second session in that series is coming up this Thursday afternoon, US Eastern Time. Each session will have 3 contributors to chapters in the book. The focus this week is on the idea of indigenous just transition, and Tom Goldtooth from IEN will be on, a journalist friend and an indigenous activist from up in Labrador fighting mega dams. And Winnie Overbeek, who's part of the World Rainforest Movement down in Brazil, will also be presenting with Brazilian indigenous activists. So it's going to be a fascinating session this Thursday at peopleshub.org. So much for the plug. So here's where we'll go from here. Grace and I are going to chat a little bit about common themes. Grace has been following the discussions that I assume have been happening in the chat while I've been presenting. We'll take, oh, this is an earlier version of this. Yikes. Oh, well. Yeah, we changed the timing on these. Let me quit out of this and just paste the current version in the chat. Okay, there's that. And There you go. And it is not posted yet. Okay, what's going on here? Now it's there. So that's our proposed outline for the rest of the session. We'll have a little bit of dialogue and look at some of the points that have come up in the chat during this conversation. We'll take a very quick stretch break for a couple of minutes, and then we'll do 25 minutes in small groups, and those are the prompts for the small groups. And then we'll have time for report backs and some general discussion. So, Grace, what should I know from what else has been happening while I've been talking? And again, sorry for cutting out some. It could have been worse. Well,
The chat has been relatively free of questions. I think you've saturated everybody's minds with all of the information. I have a couple of questions, which I can offer, and maybe we can have people chime in with other questions as we go. We have what 15 minutes, so we can have a bit of an open discussion here. So I was interested in whether you have some recent examples of severe climate events that have scientifically validated climate attribution attached to them, and if you can say more about that.
Well, at this point, pretty much every time there's a climate event that makes major headlines, that affects a large geographic area, the climate scientists are able to get right to work, and literally within a few weeks now. The first study along these lines, I should mention, came out in 2011, and it took 10 years to document the percentage of climate impact of a series of flooding events that happened in the UK in the early 2000s. When, for example, Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas Gulf Coast and flooded huge areas of Houston, actually just a couple of weeks before Hurricane Maria devastated much of the Caribbean. Within a few weeks, Kerry Emanuel's group at MIT and a number of other research groups were able to tease out the various elements of climate contribution to that hurricane and series of flooding events. And what they've done more recently, and I've got a slide illustrating this that I can dig out and post later, they've actually been able to merge together sophisticated climate models and hurricane prediction models and look at various probabilities in terms of how the frequency and especially the intensity of tropical storms is increased as a direct result of climate warming.
We have a couple of other questions that have come into the chat. Magdalene, would you like to ask this directly, or would you like me to paraphrase it?
I can perhaps say it again. Hi. So in my country, in the ecological movement is highly professionalized in NGOs, sometimes corporate NGOs, and sometimes if they're not corporate, they're still somewhat hierarchical forms. So what can we do to promote non-hierarchical organizational forms in an ecology movement?
I think that's a really important question. And this tension, excuse me, here in North America goes all the way back to the 1980s. You know, most of our environmental laws in the US came out of the 70s. They were the result of huge mobilizations around the country in the 60s, of course, and corporations eventually coming around to the understanding that they would rather have a set of uniform environmental laws on the national level than have to continually face increasingly restrictive laws and regulations and also lawsuits in various states and communities around the country, which is what was happening really, and this is rarely discussed in the lead up to the passing of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, et cetera. But very quickly here, the environmental movement became very professionalized. It became literally part of the environmental policy-making apparatus in Washington, D.C. And in the 1980s, and this is a major focus of this book that I did in the late 90s, a whole array of alternative currents began to emerge, probably the most significant and lasting of which was the environmental justice movement emerging from communities of color, really at the nexus of extreme exposure to toxic chemicals and other problems. And these various tendencies, I include the radical wilderness movement, I include a number of global South movements in this discussion. Coming out of this, there emerged a whole alternative milieu. And I think this is the case in many countries around the world. It's more difficult, I know, in places in the global South where people who are educated, who want to do good in the world and also have a secure income, tend to go to work for various bureaucracies, whether nationally or the UN, and it becomes difficult. Yes, Joe is correct. We have a nonprofit industrial complex in this country and around the world, and it's very difficult, but I think the climate justice movement has been a center in many countries, both North and South, for the emergence of vital countercurrents to the nonprofit industrial complex. You know, now every time there's a UN climate conference, and those happen typically every year in November or December, there are delegations from various countries, including NGOs, that primarily focus inside. There are organizations whose main focus is bringing issues and highlighting opposition from the outside. And then there are a few organizations that are actually able to straddle both sides, to have a presence both inside and outside the proceedings. And I think that's had a radicalizing influence on especially some of the African and Latin American delegations, official delegations in, and South Asian as well, I think of the Philippines, delegations inside the meetings. So there's a polarity, but there's also, I think, a spectrum in most countries of various groups in various places in terms of their relationship to the existing power structure. And one of the key roles of the climate justice movement has been to highlight those alternative currents and strengthen the grassroots focus. And again, a lot of ideas about organizing and movement building that go back 20 years to the Alter Globalization movement have played a really positive role, I think, in a lot of groups that have adopted a climate justice understanding, really moving in that direction. I mean, when 350.org started, it was kind of media stunts and photo ops, and then they brought in a lot of organizers from the Seattle era global justice movement and started forming local groups around the country. And that's made a big difference in what that organization looks like It's still pretty mainstream in its public face, but a lot of the organizing, I'm actually on the board of the Vermont 350 affiliate, and a lot of the organizing that happens on the ground comes from a fairly radical and explicitly intersectional and anti-racist understanding of the climate crisis.
I would like to add just a little bit to that, is that there's a pretty vibrant relocalization movement of various types that is much broader than food systems and climate, but it also focuses on building more horizontal organizations, bottom up, food sovereignty, and so forth, throughout the world. And there are a number of them, including Local Futures, Helena Norberg Hodges organization, and so forth. So yeah, thank you. Peter Musakiwa had a question. I'd let him ask it.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian, for the presentation. Now, yes, my question was whether it is possible to really scientifically and accurately measure the ecological degradation that is caused by natural phenomena and also by human beings. Why am I asking that? Because sometimes one hears some arguments that no, what is happening is just natural, and so on and so forth. So from a social ecology point of view, how do you take that? Thank you very much.
Yes, really important question. Obviously, we know from social ecology that the question of what is natural is highly contested and needs to be looked at in a dialectical and developmental way. We also know that there are systems of domination that have, for many centuries, and especially since the rise of capitalism, come to shape the way most human communities, especially in the global north, are able to express their relationship to the rest of nature. So within the constraints of that system, that many people's livelihoods and ability to survive are still bound up with, there are institutional imperatives that drive continuing extraction, continuing destruction, the continuing expansion of the scope of this system. So, but you know, rather than saying that that's unnatural, we see it as a product of particular historical developments and institutions that we want to challenge. Having said that, in the climate literature, of course, there's this continuing discussion about what changes would we be seeing anyway without the huge load of anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And the literature on that is very clear. And there's another chart that I often use in my presentations from the last IPCC report that shows known temperature trends, what we would see if only non-human, non-industrial, non-capitalist effects on the weather were taken into account, and it doesn't look anything like the real world trajectory. And then we look at climate models with greenhouse gas emissions included, and that very closely models, very closely mirrors the observed trends. And this chart's been around for 20 years, but what the last IPCC report did was break it down for each continent and each of the world's oceans. And we can see that in each particular geographic setting, the same trend applies. If we want to map anything close or simulate anything close to the observed trends over the last 50 years or over the last 100 years, the models have to include all of the anthropogenic sources of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases. So there's as there is often in the climate world, there's the political response, and there's also a scientific response, and they complement each other.
Thanks, Brian. I think it's time to take our break and cut into small groups.
If I can if I can just add one point, Laura posted a comment about the role of the military-industrial complex. Yeah. And I think that's a really crucial point. Mm-hmm. It's one that a few people in the climate movement have tried to sustain a focus on. I know there's a writer in Maine who, a friend of ours who has a local radio show, has interviewed a number of times. I'm not remembering his name, who's written extensively on this. A number of groups, Medea Benjamin had a piece that was on a number of websites last year that mapped out very specifically the climate impacts of militarism. It's something that the movement needs to focus on a lot more. I completely agree.
Yeah, and there were a couple of other messages, one in particular about indigenous movements being co-opted by the ecotourism industry, and yeah, and issues, actually there was a small discussion about what are the issues with the transition movement, which was mentioned in the chat. I think we can save those for the wrap up if people still have questions about those. And we can break into our groups now.
All right. So we need Blair to do that, and it looks like Blair is on. I thought I was going to be able to host breakouts, but it looks like only the main host can do that.
We're taking a break first before the breakout.
We're going to just take a couple of minutes stretch break, and so let's do that. And since we have 40 people, let's do 5 groups.
Sounds good to me.
I already selected 7 previously when there was a few more people.
Okay, and then set the timer for 25 minutes.
Great.
And I'll put those prompts in the chat again.
25 minutes. See you soon.
Hey, so Blair, can you listen to me? I lost connection, and I wanted to be assigned to go back to the room again. I'm not sure if there's anybody there.
Hi, yeah, 1 second.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem. Let's see here. The small one is breakout room 4, looks pretty small. Cool. You should be getting an invitation. Hey, Bug. Hi. Hi. What's Allie doing? Hey, don't scream at the cat, Allie. You don't do that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, thank you. What color is that? What color is that? What color is that? Yes. Okay, I'm reading. Oh, this is a good one.
Hey there, folks. Has it been like long since the breakout rooms have like broken out?
Second.
Like if it has been like a certain amount of time, I'll just wait here. I
Yeah,
guess.
I'll put you in one. Sorry, if you weren't in.
Yeah, if like a certain amount of time has elapsed, I'd rather just wait here. But yeah, if you could, then that'd be fine.
There's still like 15 minutes, so I'll put you in one.
Ah, great, nice. Thanks a lot, man.
No problem. Ouch, Alistair.
Yeah. Oh, there's juice here. All right, well, I'm going to take a spiritual walk to Black Beach and back, and then try to get some of this stuff. Are you in pain now?
Joanna, whoops, okay, thank you. Your phone was not muted.
I'm here. I just needed a quick break between sessions.
Yep. Okay, well, I think we're all back, and there were a couple of people who joined us, I think, during the small group, and maybe a few people who left. So we can start with, I guess, a report out of what of the more interesting questions came up in the small groups. And I don't know who was in what group, so what you should do, I think, is to just post in the chat who is representing a group to give a report back, and we'll call on you in turn as you say, call me in the chat. How's that?
So we can start with Alex.
All right.
Okay.
So I don't know what group number we were, but so we were Peter in Zimbabwe, Forrest in Berlin, Jeff in British Columbia, and myself in Tucson, Arizona. And so some of the problems that we're seeing is kind of unpredictable climate conditions and things like changing weather patterns. So this was something that Jeff talked about in British Columbia and how that's affecting crops and farming. Peter also talked about this, the way that droughts are affecting people's livelihoods and kind of more extreme temperatures as well. Forrest talked about the way that Berlin is kind of turning into a desert. In Tucson, I live in the desert, and we're seeing, you know, rising temperatures. Right now in Tucson, there's a wildfire going on. And some of the kind of questions that we had were, so Peter had a question about how can social ecology kind of articulate and channel the human virtues for people to live with the environment. So things like tenderness, being a full feeling human being, like how do we kind of cultivate that, I think was maybe hopefully the gist of Peter's question. Jeff was thinking about the way in which things kind of get co-opted. So co-optation by ecotourism industry or other kind of business, and how we can actually protect genuine movements. I had a question about dealing with kind of international solidarity. So thinking about things like climate debt, or climate reparations, these various terms, how do we deal with them on a confederated, non-hierarchical way, since we usually think about international organizations dealing with these things like the UN, for example. Forrest had a good question around sort of international shipping industry and supply chains, and kind of just how awful those things can be, but also, you know, not wanting to fall into protectionism. And they also brought up the issue of refugees and migrants and the need for solidarity, particularly as climate change is displacing people. I think that was it. Maybe a kind of good summary, hopefully.
Great, thank you. I have Joseph, Vanya, Max, Victoria, Kelly, and Laura saying that they had groups to report for. So we'll go to Joseph.
Okay, yeah. I'm reporting for group 4. We had Sasha, who's in Los Angeles, Christina, who is in Sacramento via Peru, and then Julia, who is in the Rio area of Brazil. And then myself, I am currently in the Boston area. So for the first question about how these things are affecting our local communities, Sasha talked about greenwashing in LA and how that is an issue, displacement of people and sort of gentrification in the name of environmentalism. And would like to talk more about that. Christina and myself both talked about mining. Myself, my experiences in South Dakota, her with copper mining in Peru, and these sorts of things. Julia talked about floods, drought, water pollution in the Rio area. So those were some of our local experiences. And then for the question of pressing questions we had about climate justice, Christina wanted to talk maybe more about degrowth in the global south. Sasha brought up maybe talking more about strategy and shifting from theory to practice and lived experience from the view of social ecology. And I'll stop there. We had more, but that kind of provides a summary, I think. If people want to add more from my group, they can.
Thank you. Let's hear from Vanya.
Yeah, hi. I'm representing the group. I don't remember the number, but we had Trish, Nadine, Matthew, Nuri, and myself. Trish is from Hawaii, someone from Vancouver, Matthew's from Pittsburgh, Nuri's in Europe, and I'm based in California. Talked about kind of the various geographies and how ecological crises are affecting each of them. So in Hawaii, it's pretty isolated. They ship a lot of things into the area, and they were hit pretty hard by the pandemic and hurricanes, and they're kind of realizing that tourism isn't sustainable, and they're starting to look at kind of alternative ways to support themselves economically. We also heard about how indigenous communities in Vancouver are being hit pretty hard by overfishing. So this year they unfortunately did not have any salmon for their elders' lunch, which was kind of really tragic. And their food insecurity and also economic insecurity has limited their ability to reconnect with the land and reconnect with their indigenous knowledge, which is again very, very tragic. This knowledge has been accumulated for so many years, and it doesn't take very much to kind of lose it all. And we also talked about how in Northern Appalachia, while it is isolated from a lot of natural disasters, the municipal water system has been privatized. The pipes were destroyed. There is like lead contamination, and any repair efforts have been prioritizing wealthier communities. So again, this ecological systemic injustice against less fortunate communities. And we also talked about some privatization of public spaces in places like San Francisco, but definitely not exclusive to there. Some interesting questions we had about social ecology and climate justice. We talked about how how we can use social ecology as like a way to connect the dots for people. Some people are really maybe on one side of the discussion, like maybe a very like economic side, and some people are like really on the climate justice side, but how do we use it to bring people together and like talk the same language? And kind of along that lines, we've had experience trying to help people connect these dots and finding it very challenging. So any want to hear about any suggestions that people have, and how we get kind of quality information about what the environmental damage is, and how we can kind of shift the rhetoric to something more like radical abundance, something more like palatable instead of maybe degrowth that has like a negative connotation for people. So I think it was a very interesting discussion. People feel free to chime in if I'm missing something big.
Thank you so much. Next is Max.
Hi. So my group was Grace, who is based in northeastern Vermont, which is Abenaki land. She is apparently going to tell us a lot more about what's going on with her tomorrow. We have Sev, who is from Melbourne, which is also Wurundjeri Aboriginal land. And Sev mentions that there's kind of physical pollution in his area, like lots of like styrofoam balls in like the dirt and things like that, as well as a nearby town that burns down a few years ago. Yeah, those kinds of conditions. I'm Max. I'm based in Providence area, which is partially ceded Narragansett land. And I talked about how this area is vulnerable to flooding since we're right on a bay and the lowest points in Providence are occupied by communities of color. So definitely especially vulnerable for future hurricanes and weather events of that sort. And Lemmy, who's from South Asia, joins late. Everyone, according to him, has kind of been there for thousands of years with lots of distinct languages and cultures, as well as Adivasi peoples. So yeah, to kind of recap some of the big ideas that we talked about, we were definitely kind of focusing on these big kind of questions of how do we frame the revolution, like what is true freedom versus justice? When would we know that our revolution went far enough? How can we kind of go about changing things in such a short period of time? What are the kind of like tools that will be like the specific tools that will be necessary for the revolution? All of these things are kind of, I think, ongoing discussions, but important ones to keep bringing back up. We also kind of talked about the small scale of that or the closer time scale as well, including how do we empower and spread the tools of empowerment for everyone to take self-determination and more into their own hands. How do we kind of like inspire the like spirit to keep fighting, and more directly, how do we kind of focus efforts so that we don't have to go back to life before Corona, when this like horrible pandemic is also providing the possible opportunity for radical rebuilding. Yeah, I think that covers most of it.
Great, thank you. Victoria's next for our group.
Hi, yeah, so I'm representing our group that had Brian in Vermont, me in Geneva, Haya in Massachusetts, Frank in the Philippines, and Alexis in Indiana. I think one of the main themes that we saw each person point out when talking about climate justice came a lot to farming, food access, and food deserts. along with what happens during extreme climatic events and natural disasters. Frank in the Philippines was kind of mentioning how this was affecting food production and the impact on crops and the viability of food supply in the region. Alexis in Indiana was mentioning the food deserts that are affecting the indigenous communities there, and how agricultural alliances are protesting industrial land grabs, essentially, of indigenous farmland. Haya was bringing up the droughts and extreme weather changes that affect the farming and viability there. And we also, at a larger scale, touched upon kind of the climate justice movement and these very, maybe the divide that Bookchin mentions between survival of the planet and capitalism, and how the division is really focused on either the pathways for movements that focus on green growth or degrowth, and really fleshing out where the narratives come from for international organizations, and where the narratives come from for local and community-oriented groups and people, and the importance of having the different perspectives, but also on focusing on this kind of anti-capitalist narrative, and realizing that a lot of people in developing world might have environmental activism that is actually dangerous and life-threatening, and these are kind of the issues that we have to consider moving forward when you speak about climate justice. So I think that's a broad summary.
Great, thank you. Kelly is next.
Hello, I represented the group with Gary from Vermont, who previously lived in Texas, Magdalene from the Philippines, Johanna from Boston, and Joe from Brighton, UK. I think a similar theme that developed amongst our group was the effects of climate crises on vulnerable communities, particularly on how it plays into racism and classism. Magdalene mentioned the effects of urbanization, anti-coal work, and industrialization in the Philippines, and the Philippine movement for climate justice. I talked a little bit about how in Chicago, where I'm from, about the demolition of a coal power plant that was completely botched and just covered an entire neighborhood in that was already susceptible to high rates of asthma and cancer, and just blanketed it in smoke. Gary talked about his experiences in Texas, and how Hurricane Harvey really devastated vulnerable communities, and how there is a permanent drought going on in Western Texas, and how in the Dallas and Houston and urban areas of Texas are becoming heat islands due to the temperature rising, and the concrete and structure of the cities, and how most of the poor don't have air conditioning, and how the state of Texas is completely controlled by oil and gas. Joe mentioned how there's a lot of denialism of climate change in the UK, because she said especially now it's unseasonably hot, and the weather is nice, and people are kind of just turning a blind eye because they're enjoying the weather. But there is a lot more flooding in the region that she lives in, and this is really affecting the underclass. And in terms of real estate, the flood mapping has made flood zones cheaper to live in, which kind of furthers the class divide. And the questions that kind of came up for our group, and please, anybody from my group, feel free to chime in because my notes are kind of all over the place. But Maxlin mentioned how can we promote climate justice in a way that is non-hierarchical and not run by NGOs, and similarly, how do we keep it from getting co-opted basically from green liberal movements, and how do we add in the voices of vulnerable communities, people of color, poor communities? How do we keep that from being co-opted by the middle class? And I think that's it.
And Laura's speaking for the last group. Laura, are you still here?
So
there
I was
you
in the
are.
group, yeah, hi. So I was in the group with Joshu, Ginny, and Aaron. Okay. And so Joshu is based in what is now called Antigua, but the original name for it was Walidi Island, and it was the Kalinago indigenous people, and actually he's telling me now that they invaded the Taino people. So it was originally Taino, then it became Kalinago, and then of course we know that the Europeans came and colonized it. So he was saying that one of the big climate issues there is, of course, that being in the Caribbean, they're very impacted by hurricanes. So global warming is really increasing the intensity and fury of that, and also that they are at risk of sea level rise, that they would be the first to be impacted. So that's really an issue for them. Ginny from Calgary spoke. So she was saying that she's on Blackfoot Confederacy occupied land, and she said that a big environmental issue there is the oil industry, and she actually said that the mayor had said that this was going to be a good time for them to increase the extraction because the COVID-19 lockdown has made it impossible for people to protest them doing this. So that's a pretty disgusting move on their part. Erin talked about Minneapolis. She said she had only just moved there in the past year, so she doesn't know that much about what's going on environmentally yet. She did say that the big issue was protecting the lakes, of course, and that there were some local artists that were doing some, she said it was like they were doing an artistic protest on water preservation to kind of draw attention to that issue. I am in Middlesex County, Connecticut. I am on occupied Wangunk land, and there is really not any indigenous presence on this land as far as I know. I do know that there are some people who identify as Wangunk. I have never actually met one of them, and I grew up here, so that really says a lot. And of course the history of this land being New England, these were the original settlers coming over from England, and basically the Wangunk population was wiped out by epidemics that they brought with them, and of course settler colonialism of that time. So it's really terrible, but there's really not much of a presence in that way here at all. And the main indigenous presence that we know about in Connecticut is the Mohegans, and basically associated with the casino industry now. So, and as far as environmental issues in this area, so I actually grew up here, but I've only been here a few months. I was teaching in China for 3 years, so I don't know that much. I do know that there is some environmental movement going on here, that they banned plastic bags last year, and but I don't know very much beyond that. So some questions that came up, Ginny mentioned the what came up in the Sylvia Federici talk last night about the necessity of having a community that can extricate itself from capitalism. How can you build such a strong mutual aid-based community that would be able to do that, and how can it be not just some sort of like privilege bubble with people who have the resources and time to do that, and basically not so accessible to people who aren't being a part of that process. Joshu wanted to know more about how to apply what he's been learning through social ecology in his community in Antigua. And he was very concerned about the special economic zone as a result of structural adjustment programs, I'm assuming from the West Bank, from the World Bank. He said that there were corporations coming in, they don't have to obey the island's laws environmentally in terms of labor laws. They have their own armies. And what can be done about that? How can social ecology inform a movement of resistance against that? Erin wanted to know, again, how do we create these communities in a way that is accessible to local people and also makes them want to join? And Joshua had a really good insight on that. He said, well, basically by collaborating with them rather than just including them in something that you're doing. And my question, I'm very interested in using or applying the ideas of social ecology to build a communalist movement for and by homeless people in collaboration with non-homeless people who are involved in social ecology. I feel like that's a really obvious group of people that would have a lot to gain from something like this, and also I think would provide amazing contributions and insight into something like this. But my concern about it is, how would you build such a movement, and specifically this issue of acquiring land to build such a movement? Because obviously, number one, they're not going to have resources to put into it in terms of material resources. And so, how would you buy land without, reinforcing, contributing to the capitalist system? And also, the question again of colonialism, because, especially in the US, this is occupied First Nations land. So I had some questions about that. And that was it.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like we had another round of incredibly rich discussions, and I think even though we don't have time to respond to everything, I think all of the issues that you've highlighted are really crucial ones that hopefully will be the focus of a lot more discussion. I want to go through some of these very briefly, starting with some of the more specific ones into the more general ones. I'd also like to give Grace a chance to respond and introduce us to the discussion that we'll be having tomorrow morning. So I hope it's okay to go maybe 5-10 minutes over time to a little bit past noon. I hope that's okay with everybody. I know it's very late in some parts of the world right now. Some of the more specific questions. Co-optation and greenwashing, continual threats to radical perspectives in the environmental movement and many movements. I think one of the key responses is the one that Chaya raised in my small group, which is continuing to emphasize the roots of these problems in capitalism and how anti-capitalism is often a clear divide between the people who are articulating a radical outlook and those who aren't. One of the positive things that I'll point out is that in the last 3 or 4 years in the climate justice movement that I've seen, people are increasingly willing to talk about capitalism, and that's even true in our local 350 affiliate among many of the staff members. So there are openings, just as there are increasing openings to be talking about racism and the roots of racism in the evolution of US history. in much more comprehensive ways, I think the openness to talking about capitalism is increasing. The whole issue of climate debt and responsibility, I have a section of the introduction to my new book where I look at a lot of the literature on who's responsible for emissions. And in the UN discourse, it's typically focused on nation states, but there's research recently that really focuses in on who are the responsible sectors of the population in the various countries that are the source of most of the emissions. And there's research even tying it to specific corporations and specific institutions. And I think that's an important ongoing discussion. The response to gentrification and the increasing greening of gentrification is a huge issue. It's a problem in Detroit, where a lot of the neighborhoods that have big community gardens, where people have reclaimed abandoned land and done positive things with it, have become targets for gentrification. And I think some of the continuing resistance in those communities are important examples to look at. On water issues, the situation in Detroit as well, and also in Flint, Michigan, which was another center of automobile production that's been the focus of, that's been the target of one of the most extreme cases of water injustice in the US in recent years. Community-based alternatives to reclaiming water systems are one of the themes explored in my book. Marcela Oliveira from Bolivia has a chapter where she talks about the water wars over corporate control over water in her city of Cochabamba 20 years ago, and how that's evolved into a movement for reclaiming water systems on the local level. Increased extraction and companies taking advantage of the difficulty of mounting protests during the pandemic to increase extraction. That's a story I've seen in a number of places. At the same time, as somebody mentioned, the rebuilding that's now necessary from the pandemic creates tremendous opportunities that didn't exist before. While some communities have been absolutely devastated and the infection rate is increasing in many places in the US, in Brazil, in India, and other parts of the world, and interestingly, more in places with current authoritarian regimes than any others. We've also seen city streets being closed off from vehicles to create more socially distanced public space in many countries. We've seen temporary but significant reduction in emissions due to less driving and less production and less extraction for a limited period of time. And that expands the sense of possibility, I think, in many places. And then around people without homes and potential for organizing there, several of the Symbiosis affiliated groups in the Pacific Northwest have been doing a lot of work with houseless populations in Portland, Seattle, Olympia, a few other places, and I think there are some really interesting models there to draw upon. I think the bigger overarching issues around the potential for social ecology to help us focus on positive values in our communities and how to bring those out, the difficulties of, for some people to engage social ecology as a holistic framework, how to move beyond the limits of current mutual aid organizing. I mean, it's fine for and it's essential for communities of people to help people who are unable to meet their basic needs in the pandemic to do that. But there have also been a number of efforts, again, by a lot of Symbiosis affiliated groups that have really explicitly tried to reach beyond that, to talk in their communities about what happens when capitalism and the state can't meet people's basic needs, and the need to, as we heard, create genuine institutions of dual power. I think in social ecology, we often emphasize the extent to which cooperative values, values of mutual aid and cooperation and communalism span many cultures and many communities, and there's a long history around the world of more cooperative values being in the forefront. There's a book that I contributed to that's got about 100 chapters from around the world that looks at examples of communalist values being played out in literally every corner of the world. Federico De Maria, who's a degrowther and social ecologist, is one of the editors, along with the acclaimed anthropologist Arturo Escobar, who was Haya's dissertation advisor, among other things. The book is called Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary. Tremendous examples of how the kinds of values we talk about in social ecology have currents in dozens and dozens of cultural groups around the world. So, you know, we keep our eyes on the prize. We keep our eyes on the underlying potentiality for revolutionary change. And at the same time, we know revolution is an ongoing process. Sometimes there are moments where things change dramatically and unexpectedly in a very short time. We may be in one of those moments right now, but most of the time it's a long process. It's a process full of tension and contradiction. And when we look at the underlying potentialities that emerge from these points of tension and contradiction, hopefully we can see our way toward a meaningfully different way of life and a meaningfully different way of organizing our societies. I want to turn it over to Grace to see what thoughts you have and to introduce us to what we'll be talking about tomorrow, and try to take just a few more minutes.
Okay, well, I don't think that I could elaborate any more on the list of things that you just gave in response without many more minutes. But I certainly will be addressing most specifically the movements for food sovereignty and land justice tomorrow, and in particular the roots of the current system of, you know, food injustice and degradation, land degradation in the original sin of slavery, as well as the genocide of the First Nations. So the roots of racism and the promise offered by the very recent rising leadership of food movements, and in particular by people of color and in the indigenous population, which has been extremely heartening, as well as how that why that's become more and more acknowledged by the communities of color as a primary importance. So changing the food system as the leading edge of the revolution of relocalization and direct democracy and mutual aid is kind of the theme of what I'll be discussing tomorrow. And I will be looking forward to more great questions as we delve into that issue. There's a whole lot. I've driven myself crazy by collecting information that comes into my inbox multiple times a day that I say, oh, I've got to mention this. So most of it's been trying to filter out stuff that's too much detail. So hopefully I'll be able to give you more signals about where to find more information on all of this. And I thank you for being here.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to everybody for all of your brilliant comments and questions this morning. This afternoon session starts at 1:30, which is an hour and a half from now, approximately, for people in other time zones. It's going to be a discussion of understanding and overcoming capitalism with Blair and Peter. So that should be another outstanding session, and look forward to seeing everybody then.
Bye all. Thank you.